The desert was alive with heat, a shimmering mirage over endless stretches of sand and stone where the forward operating base sat like a steel outpost against the void. Inside its walls, soldiers moved with the rhythm of routine, patrols changing shifts, supply crates being hauled, distant gunfire echoing across the horizon like a haunting drumbeat. Amid the hardened warriors who carried scars and rifles with equal weight, Kalira Dravik was an anomaly. She was not a soldier, not trained for combat. Her place was in the heart of the base, buried in stacks of manifests, oil-stained gloves, and the hum of generators. She worked as a logistics coordinator, the kind of person soldiers rarely noticed until something broke or supplies ran dry. Yet despite the quiet nature of her role, she carried herself with a presence that was difficult to ignore. Her sharp gaze and steady movement suggested discipline forged by something deeper than routine paperwork. Kalira had always felt like an intruder in this world of uniforms and weapons. Her hands were meant for wrenches and data pads, not rifles. She kept her distance when the units trained in live fire drills, their chants echoing the names of ancient warriors, Khalid ibn al-Walid, Saladin, Timur, as if invoking the spirits of battle. She admired their strength, but in the silence of her quarters at night, she told herself she could never be like them. Her father's voice sometimes haunted her in memory, a veteran who once fought in brutal campaigns. "Courage is not a uniform, Kalira," he had told her when she was young. "Courage is what you do when no one else is left." She never knew what he truly meant, but the words stayed with her like a dormant flame. The soldiers treated her with a mix of casual respect and teasing amusement. They called her quartermaster, or sometimes Steel Heart, because she worked without complaint and seemed unaffected by the constant pressure around her. Captain Idrin Vainak, the officer commanding the defense of the base, often stopped by her station. His voice was stern, but his eyes revealed concern when he said, "Stay inside if trouble comes. Your job is to keep us moving, not fight." She nodded each time, though part of her wondered if she hated the thought of being helpless. The desert sky at dusk burned red and orange, painting the armored walls of the base in firelight. Distant thunder rolled, not from the heavens, but from artillery somewhere far across the dunes. Rumors traveled fast between soldiers. Enemy movements, convoys seen in the north, intercepted chatter of an attack. The veterans didn't flinch. They had heard such things before. Yet Kalira noticed the way their hands lingered longer on their weapons and how the night patrols grew thicker. The base, though sturdy, suddenly felt fragile, as if the sand itself whispered of blood yet to be spilled. Kalira worked late into the evening, checking shipment records under the flicker of a dim lamp. The barracks were quiet except for muffled laughter from soldiers trying to mask unease. Outside, searchlights swept the desert, pale beams cutting across the night. She glanced at the wall clock, rubbing dust from her eyes when a tremor rippled beneath her feet. A dull boom followed, faint but unmistakable, then another. She froze, every muscle tense. In the next instant, the alarm wailed across the base, a shrill cry that sent men scrambling into gear and rifles snapping into hands. Kalira's pulse hammered. She stepped outside and saw the sky lit with streaks of fire, mortars arcing in, their trails glowing like meteors. The ground shook as explosions tore into the outer wall, sending sand and debris into the air. Shouts rose from every corner. Orders barked, weapons locked, boots pounding against metal walkways. She stood still for a moment, caught between instinct to hide and the undeniable pull of something else. For the first time, she realized her father's words had not been about soldiers or wars. They were about moments like this, when survival demanded more than fear. As the first wave of enemy fire crashed upon the base, Kalira knew the world she had clung to, the world of repairs, paperwork, and routine, was gone. Something greater was about to begin, something that would test every silent ember of strength she never admitted she had. ChatGPT said the night descended into chaos as fire and steel rained upon the base. Enemy soldiers poured through the breaches in the wall, their shouts carried by the desert wind, rifles flashing in the darkness. The defenders scrambled to hold their ground, but the onslaught was relentless, and for every attacker that fell, 2 more seemed to appear. Kalira had never known such noise, explosions ripping apart the silence, bullets whistling past, screams of pain colliding with orders barked in desperation. She crouched behind a supply crate, her breath ragged, hands trembling against the cold steel of a rifle she had picked up from the ground. It was heavier than she imagined, smelling of oil and smoke, yet its weight seemed to steady her heart. Captain Idrin shouted across the courtyard, rallying his men, but she saw the despair in his eyes when a mortar round struck the command tower, engulfing it in fire. The officer staggered, blood streaming down his arm before he vanished into the haze of dust and smoke. Panic rippled through the ranks without his commanding presence, soldiers breaking formation, retreating toward the inner defenses. Kalira knew if the line collapsed here, the base would be lost. She pressed her back to the crate, her father's words echoing again. "Courage is what you do when no one else is left." She inhaled once, then stepped into the open, raising the rifle with shaking arms. The first enemy soldier she faced was only a few meters away, advancing with a knife after running out of ammunition. His eyes widened as she fired, the recoil jolting her shoulder, the man collapsing into the dust. The shot burned through her, both terrifying and liberating. She stumbled back, chest heaving. But instead of retreating, she pushed forward, following the trail of attackers breaching through the shattered wall. Around her, soldiers fell, comrades dragged the wounded to safety, and cries of agony tore through the smoke-filled air. Each step Kalira took felt like walking into a storm meant to consume her, yet her feet refused to turn back. A group of enemies cornered 3 young recruits near the fuel depot. Their rifles were empty, their eyes wild with fear, knowing the end had come. Kalira did not hesitate. She flanked the attackers, her shots precise, driven not by training but by raw instinct. When the last body dropped, the recruits stared at her in disbelief, their fear giving way to fragile hope. "Move, defend the depot," she shouted, surprising even herself with the authority in her voice. They obeyed without question. And for a moment she felt something ignite inside her, a transformation she never thought possible. But the tide of battle showed no mercy. An explosion ripped through the armory, sending flames into the night, ammunition cooking off in a chain reaction that rattled the entire base. The heat scorched her face as she threw herself to the ground. When she rose, coughing and blinded by smoke, she saw one of the recruits she had just saved lying lifeless, shrapnel buried in his chest. The sight struck her harder than any explosion. Her hands shook as she touched his shoulder, the reality of war crashing over her. But before sorrow could paralyze her, another wave of enemies surged forward. She gritted her teeth, tightened her grip, and fired again. Every corner of the base had become a battlefield. Friends turned into corpses within heartbeats. Structures that once offered safety now burned like pyres. Still, Kalira fought, each kill no longer just survival, but defiance. Fear clawed at her throat, but it was drowned by something stronger. Rage at the invaders who dared to shatter her world. She began moving with purpose, setting traps in narrow corridors, using grenades to create deadly ambushes, her mind adapting faster with every passing second. She was no longer just reacting. She was hunting. And yet with every victory, the weight grew heavier. Each fallen comrade reminded her that survival came with a price. She caught glimpses of men she had spoken to hours ago, faces now pale, lifeless, buried beneath rubble or riddled with bullets. Still, the enemy would not stop, and neither could she. Sweat and blood ran into her eyes, her body aching from recoil and exhaustion, but the fire inside her burned brighter. The battle raged on without end, and the outcome remained uncertain. The base was breaking apart, the defenders dwindling, and the enemy seemed endless. Yet amidst the chaos, Kalira's resolve hardened. The civilian who once feared the sound of gunfire was gone. In her place stood a fighter whose will was carved from loss, whose courage had been awakened by necessity. Each shot she fired asked the same question of fate: what next? And though the answer was hidden in smoke and fire, she no longer dreaded it. She was ready to meet it head-on. The night stretched on like an endless trial, the desert sky thick with smoke and fire until dawn crept slowly across the horizon. The battle had turned into a brutal contest of endurance, one side refusing to give up its ground, the other determined to drown the base in blood. By the time the first light bled into the sky, the once secure outpost was reduced to rubble and twisted steel. Yet among the carnage stood Kalira Dravik, weapon clenched tight in her hands, her clothes torn, her body streaked with dirt and blood. Around her lay the proof of what she had done. 20 enemy soldiers fallen by her hand, each kill carved from desperation, instinct, and an unshakable refusal to surrender. The surviving defenders gathered slowly from the shadows, their faces pale with exhaustion, eyes red from smoke and grief. They had lost too many men, too many friends, but they had not lost the base. Against all odds, against the overwhelming force that had descended on them, the line had held. And when they spoke of how it had been done, every voice carried the same name, Kalira. She had stepped forward when others faltered, rallied them when despair threatened to break their spirit. Without her, the gates would have fallen, and the enemy would have swept through with no resistance left to stop them. Captain Idrin was found alive beneath the collapsed tower, his body battered, but his spirit unbroken. When he was brought before her, he did not speak as an officer, but as a man humbled. His eyes locked on hers, and with a rough, hoarse voice he said, "You saved us. You saved all of us." The words struck her harder than any bullet could have. She had never sought glory, never wished for such recognition. She had only wanted to survive. Yet in surviving, she had become something more, a shield, a symbol, a warrior forged not by training but by choice. The cost, however, lingered like smoke that refused to clear. The sight of comrades lost, men and women she had shared meals and laughter with just hours before, haunted her with every step she took. Among them lay the young recruit who had once looked at her with relief after she saved his life, now forever silent. Each face carved itself into her memory, reminding her that courage always demanded sacrifice. Victory, she realized, was never clean. It was stained with the weight of those who would never see another dawn. As the medics tended to the wounded and engineers began shoring up what little remained of the defenses, Kalira walked through the ruins in silence. The base, though scarred, still stood because she had refused to yield. The soldiers she passed saluted her, not out of duty but out of respect, their eyes reflecting gratitude and awe. Some whispered a name already beginning to spread, the Steel Heart of the Desert. It was a title she neither sought nor rejected, but one she carried with quiet acceptance. She knew what it meant. She was no longer invisible, no longer just a civilian worker hidden behind stacks of supplies. She had stepped into a legacy written in fire and blood. When the sun finally rose above the dunes, bathing the battlefield in light, Kalira stood at the highest point of the wall, gazing out over the sands. The wind tugged at her hair, the scent of smoke and iron still thick in the air. She felt the weight of the rifle in her hands, no longer foreign but familiar, as though it had become an extension of her will. She understood now what her father had meant. Courage was not found in titles or ranks. It was found in moments when fear tried to claim you and you stood unbroken. The war would continue. More battles would come, more losses, more nights filled with fire. But this day, this stand, would not be forgotten. In the years to follow, when soldiers spoke of impossible odds and unyielding spirit, they would tell the story of the civilian worker who became a warrior. And though Kalira carried the sorrow of the fallen within her heart, she also carried their honor. Her final thought as she looked across the endless desert was simple, unshaken, and eternal. They came for us, and we did not fall.